Sonic the Hedgehog had a struggling life on the Sega Saturn. But what would I have done differently? This video is going to be me explaining to you guys and exploring what I would have done to make the Sonic games on the Sega Saturn better. So let's begin with the launch of the Saturn, 1995. Well, the first thing I would have done is ported over Sonic CD to the Sega Saturn, because they didn't have a solid Sonic game in 1995 when the Saturn launched. They didn't have Sonic 3D Blast yet, so why not port over Sonic CD to the Sega Saturn? And maybe you could have added a little bit of stuff to the game here and there, like maybe like 3D backgrounds or something, but it still would have been really cool for people, because not everyone back in the day owned a Sega CD. So this way you could have had the Sega Saturn launch with a Sonic title. And even though history would have told us that they botched the launch in the United States, at least it still would have launched with a Sonic title. Next we come to 1996. Sadly, the game that I think looked amazing was Sonic X-treme. Yes, it still needed some work, but I still really loved what I saw, so that got cancelled. So then Sonic 3D Blast came out for the Sega Saturn for Christmas of 1996. And I always loved Sonic 3D Blast, so I don't mind that it's on the Saturn. I love this game, and they made a lot of improvements in the Saturn version that I think it makes it worth purchasing. I can see back in the day, if you grew up in the 80s, by the time the Saturn launched and you were a Sega fan, if you were like 16 to 18 years old, I can see why that generation was pissed seeing Sonic 3D Blast appear on the Saturn when it was just meant to be the swan song of Sonic's career on the Genesis. But if you were a 90s kid like me and grew up in the 1990s and were 6 or 7 or 8 or whatever, and you owned a Sega Saturn in 1996 and you got Sonic 3D Blast, I would have had a blast. I would have loved it. So if you were like a young kid, you would have loved it on the Saturn. Why does all these Sega fanboys have to constantly act like the only viewpoint to have about Sonic 3D Blast on the Saturn is from the perspective of like someone who was in their late teens or something like that? There were lots of Sega fans back in the day, and they all weren't born in the 80s, you know? I love the fact that this is on the Sega Saturn, because they made the cover better. Like, Sonic looks amazing on this 3D cover. Now, a couple of changes, though, I would have added to the game. Apparently they only had like 7 weeks or something to port this over to the Saturn, but if I would have rewritten history, if I would have been the president of Sega, I would have saw what was happening with Sonic X-treme. I would have been vigilant and seeing what they were doing and seeing how it probably wasn't going to happen. And I would have told developers, hey, before it's too late, just in case as a backup plan, let's start working on Sonic 3D Blast for the Saturn now, early 96, just in case Sonic X-treme didn't make it to Christmas 1996. That's what should have happened. And then they would have had more time. They would have had like a year to add all this extra cool shit to the 3D Blast version on the Saturn. And this is the kind of stuff I would have added. Have a giant floating ring in the first level, right after you do the loop and cross the bridge. Have it standing right there. Naturally, as the player, you want to jump right into that thing. Then it sends you to the 3D special stage, which was in the original version. For the Saturn version, make it so that you don't even have to find Knuckles or Tails and get 50 rings in order to get to this point. Have these giant rings in the levels that you can just jump into. I have like 2 of them per level, and this way it makes it easier for you to collect the emeralds, and you don't have to search for Tails or Knuckles. It was cool in the Genesis version because it was like very secretive, but this is the Saturn and we want to show off Sonic in 3D, so really this would have been a better option. It would have been easier for players to access the 3D special stages in Sonic 3D Blast on the Saturn this way. Also, before you begin each level of the game, make it an option that you could play as either Tails or Knuckles. That would have been amazing. How about that? This way you can play as 3D Tails and Knuckles in the special stages also. There's quite a lot of complaints about Sonic 3D Blast that I still to this day don't understand. I think it's a fun game. Is it a little bit of a pain in the ass? Yes, because you have to collect all the flickies and whatever. But Sonic is still pretty speedy. It's nice to have a different kind of mainline Sonic game in 3D Blast at the time, because before its release, all the Sonic games were just, you know, the typical Sonic title. I think it still has the spirit of the Sonic games, though. Does Sonic play the same in 3D Blast that he does in the traditional 2D games? No. But visually, does Sonic 3D Blast look like a Sonic game with the charm and everything? Absolutely. You got the palm trees everywhere, the checkered floor, the colorful robot enemies, the music. Yes, it has that classic Sonic charm to it, which for some apparent reason gets completely ignored when people review this game. Plus, on the front cover of the Saturn box, you could have had some text that said something like, with more 3D or something. Also on the front cover of the box, have it say you can play as Tails or Knuckles. Also, in 1996, since the Saturn was struggling, why not release the Sega Saturn, make it a bundle pack with Sonic 3D Blast, the Saturn version? Because that strategy helped the Genesis become a success over the Super Nintendo, because they used to bundle Sonic 1 and 2 and the Sonic games with the Genesis. So why not do it for this? Yes, I know in 1996 Super Mario 64 came out and Crash Bandicoot came out. They both blew the competition out of the way, but at least these changes to Sonic 3D Blast for the Saturn would have made people look a little differently at 3D Blast, and these changes may have improved the quality of the game and would have made fans maybe change their mind a little bit about Sonic 3D Blast. And like I said, if they did my strategy, they would have had more time to implement these ideas. Around this time during the late 90s, a great 3D Sonic game did actually come out, with polygons and all, in all its glory. Sonic the Fighters was released for the arcade in Japan, and in the United States it was called a Sonic Championship, which is stupid, but whatever. There used to be these magazine articles back in the day that hyped Sega fans up, and they said in these magazines that Sonic the Fighters was going to get released for the Sega Saturn, and this never fucking happened. This absolutely should have occurred. I mean, people would have loved to have Sonic the Fighters on their Sega Saturns at home, because even during this time, most Sonic fans didn't even know Sonic the Fighters was even real. It was so rare to find, especially in the United States. Probably because most of Sega's resources were going to the Saturn itself. There was a rumor I heard at the time, and I guess you can call this video game folklore, that I heard that Sega got nervous and there were people in Sega that didn't want to put Sonic the Fighters on the Saturn because they were worried that parents weren't going to like Sonic and the gang fighting each other, and they thought it was going to be too violent for Sonic the Hedgehog. I think that's really silly, and I think it was a mistake that they didn't put it on the Saturn. It's not like Sonic and the gang never fought each other before. In the 2D games, Sonic beat the shit out of Robotnik at the end of every, second level. And then in Sonic the Hedgehog 3, he has a fight with Knuckles. So it's not like they never fought each other before. And in the Sonic cartoons, on television at the time, Sonic and the gang used to destroy robots and beat up monsters and stuff all the time. Plus, Sonic was already a more edgier character than Mario. It's not like Sonic the Fighters is like Mortal Kombat kind of violent. There were some fighting games that did come out that weren't as violent as others, such as like Raru Kids for the N64, and also Nintendo came out with Super Smash Bros. In 1999, and sure, that's a violent game, right? But it's Nintendo kind of violent. It's violent in that it's not extremely violent, it's like cartoony violent. So this would have worked perfectly for Sonic and the gang to release this on the Sega Saturn. Such a golden missed opportunity of a game that was very much completed and released already. All they needed to do was to port it to the Saturn, which I believe was capable because during the Saturn's lifespan, a game was released called Fighters Mega Mix, and in that game you can actually unlock Bark the Polar Bear and Bean the Dynamite, two fighters that debuted from Sonic the Fighters. Looking back, in my opinion, I think it should have been Sonic and Tails, but whatever. It's kind of cool that it is Bark and Bean because they were the two new boys in during Sonic the Fighters, so whatever, but still. If they can take the sprites from the arcade and port them to the Saturn, like what they did with Bark and Bean, I don't see why they could have done that with all the other fighters from the game and port it over to the Sega Saturn. Plus, those magazine articles that were saying how it was coming out for the Saturn, there was a lot of screenshots that looked pretty different from the arcade version that we all wound up knowing about. I can't tell if these are supposed to be the beta version of Sonic the Fighters for the arcade, or if this is supposed to be the beta version of the port they were planning to release of Sonic the Fighters for the Saturn. It could be either or. If so, it was very capable to release Sonic the Fighters for the Sega Saturn. Now looking back in time, Virtua Fighter became the Sonic for the Sega Saturn, because there were so many Virtua Fighter games on the Sega Saturn, and on the Genesis there was so many Sonic games. But I think Sega overestimated the popularity of Virtua Fighter. It was huge, enormous in Japan, and I love Virtua Fighter, and it was awesome that we got it here in the States for the Saturn. But Sonic was more popular in the United States than in Japan, so there should have been more Sonic games on the Saturn than Virtua Fighter games. Since Sonic the Fighters was released, I believe in 1996, something like that, then that means they already had the game complete, so porting it, making a port for the Saturn, it could have came out in late 1996 for the Sega Saturn. So now, under my supervision, there has been 3 Sonic games in 2 years. Now we come to 1997. Assuming that they really only had enough time to put out 2 Sonic games this year, as history has shown us, because the Saturn was dying and they were rushing and shit, there was Sonic Jam and Sonic R. And I love both of these games. I think history has been kind to them, but again, I can understand at the time this was kind of a painful experience for Sega fans. Still though, it was cool that we did get to see some 3D Sonic stuff on the Saturn at all. I mean, guys, imagine if there was nothing. Imagine if they just released Sonic 3D Blast for the Saturn and we never got Sonic R or Sonic Jam. Just imagine that. But anyway, I want to make some improvements to both of these games, which would have helped them be more favorable to the Sega loyal at the time. First of all, Sonic Jam. It should have included a second disc, which could have included Knuckles Chaotix on it. And maybe, how about the arcade version of Sega Sonic the Hedgehog? You know, like something extra, like these rare, great Sonic games that a lot of fans, even the hardcore Sega fans at the time, a lot of them didn't get to play. That would have been amazing. Also, the problem with Sonic Jam and Sonic R is that even though they're good games, they're lacking in content. There's just not enough stuff there. It needed more replay value. It needed more stages, it needed more stuff. It was just not enough stuff there for both the games. So for Sonic Jam, like, why is there only one hub world? Really? I mean, come on. Also, like, we hear the same music just looped endlessly in that one hub world. Since it's the only one we have, why can't they change the song like every other song? Like, every time that the song ends, go to a different Sonic song that fits in that hub world. Have it be like 5 songs you can keep listening to. Also, on the second disc, include 2 more hub worlds for Sonic to run around in. You can do the same thing I said about the Saturn version of 3D Blast. Just put a giant ring up on the cliff, and you jump in the ring, and it brings you to the next one. On the second disc for Sonic Jam, you could have like an ice world, an ice hub world. That'd be pretty badass, right? You can have music from like Ice Cap Zone in there, or new music, a new track. And then the second world could be a fire world or something. There's like fire everywhere, like a molten lava kind of world. And you have to like grab onto tails to float over all the lava and stuff. Also, there should have been an extra mission for all 3 of these hub worlds. Why is it only just get the rings and that's it? They should have made it, you had to collect the 7 emeralds. And they're like in secret spots in the hub world. And when you get all 7, you turn to Supersonic, and then you can run around, I guess, as Supersonic. Like, have each hub world have 7 emeralds you could collect. It's kind of like a Easter egg treasure hunt, but with Chaos Emeralds. Also, I love the cover of Sonic Jam for the Sega Saturn, but here's the problem. Sonic, Tails, and Knuckles are 2D on the cover, which is awesome. 2D animation is better, but they're really 2D on this cover because the way they released Sonic Jam, a lot of the marketing for it was that it included the Genesis games, which all the Sega fans already had at the time. So I think that's kind of why they're 2D on the cover. But what they should have done for this cover is have a 3D art of Sonic, Tails, and Knuckles on the front of Sonic Jam, so that it allowed the player to think, and it's true that this does have 3 3D hub worlds to run around in, because that makes sense, you know? So those are the kind of changes I'd make to Sonic Jam, which is really stuff that Sega fans and Sonic fans especially would have loved at the time. And now we come to Sonic R. So for Sonic R, there's only like frickin' 5 stages. Why can't it be 8 stages? Why can't it be something like that? Add at least 3 more stages. I understand they were pressed for time, so for the 3 extra stages you add to Sonic R, you don't have to include all the secrets in them, like getting the emeralds and the coins and stuff like that. They could just be regular racing levels. That's fine. At least it's more levels to play. And even if they were pressed for time, they could have been shorter levels, but at least they would have been there. Anything would have been better than just 5 levels in the whole entire game. Jesus. Also, make Sonic R 4 players. 4 players split screen. That's what they should have done for Sonic R. Why only 2 players? Especially at this time in 1997, Mario Kart 64 came out, and there was also Diddy Kong Racing, which both had 4-player racing. Especially for this competition, they should have absolutely had the option of playing with 4 characters. Also, what they could have done was they could have released Sonic R in like this little box or whatever, and it includes a Sega multi-tap, so that you don't have to buy it yourself. Now you'd have to spend a little more cash to get 2 extra controllers, right? But at least you had the multi-tap. And owning the multi-tap when you buy the game encourages you to buy 2 controllers and hang out with your friends to play 4-player Sonic R. And it's not like that couldn't have been done, because they did that with the release of Nights into Dreams. Back in the day in the USA, there was a version that you could buy of Nights into Dreams that included the 3D Saturn pad controller, which was awesome. So why not include the multi-tap for Sonic R? Also, as a side note, I do love the tracks, I think, in Sonic R. It's more interesting, and the fact that they actually got real bands and singers to perform these tracks shows so much more creativity than just making regular video game music. So it's whatever. But for all the fans that didn't like that soundtrack for the levels, have it be an option in the menu that you could change it to like these new rock tunes that these bands could have had made for each of the levels. This way, whatever your preference is, you can pick either or. And there you have it. And under my supervision, there would have been 5 Sonic games released for the Sega Saturn. I think all my suggestions are vast improvements. If they were just a little more strategic and the management was better, then all these Sonic games we could have gotten. They just needed a little more time. But I still think what we got on the Saturn was good. It wasn't just pretty good, it was good. They were solid, good games. All 3 of them. And depending on your perspective, they all have hints of greatness in them. So that's my opinion, these are my ideas, and as fans, we could make mods of these games and add all these things that I'm talking about to these games. Why not? Also, why aren't there fans making a fan version of Sonic the Fighters for the Sega Saturn? Fans should be doing that, because we do have the sprites for Bark the Polar Bear and Bean the Dynamite from Fighters Mega Mix, so if people can learn the source code of how they got them in there, then you can add in all the other Sonic the Fighters characters. Try to recreate or something the original levels from Sonic the Fighters, or make new ones that are very similar, and there you have it. The fans can release a port of Sonic the Fighters for the Sega Saturn. That'd be so badass. Anyway, my name is SuperPat98. Thank you for watching.